coming into the Zoom room. Welcome to the conference. This is, again, the Moral Psychology Research Group Conference for 2024, crossover event with the Consortium on Moral Decision Making. So today we have two speakers, two keynote addresses by Taya Cohen and Larissa Solomon. They'll kick us off here today, and then over the next couple of days here at Penn State, we'll have a variety of speakers from psychology, anthropology, communications, media ethics, who will talk about their work. It's historically, this group, the Moral Psychology Research Group, is one that we hosted an event of theirs in 2017, but the actual collective of folks goes back almost over 2 decades at this point. People from psychology and philosophy who are interested in thinking about the relationship between science and ethics and how to build a field of moral psychology, where we think about what does it mean to make moral and ethical decisions, and what are the philosophical normative implications of doing so. And so the goal of the conference today is to bring some of those folks here, but also try to tap into some of the resources we have here at Penn State, some of the wonderful minds that we have within our community here from across disciplines to try to spark new conversations. This is the first main event this year for the Consortium on Moral Decision Making that I run here at Penn State, the goal of which is to try to instigate, create these kinds of interdisciplinary conversations and see where they lead. And so we also have some special guests from outside of Penn State as well, and outside of the MPRG, the research group. And so, yeah, hopefully those of you who are online, if you have any questions, this is set up as a webinar, but if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. We will take questions after each speaker's talk. And so the format is we'll have Taya Cohen speak from about 3:10 to 4:10 or so. We'll take a small break, and then we'll have Larissa Solomon give her talk subsequently. Let me briefly introduce our first speaker. So Taya Cohen is a professor of organizational behavior and business ethics at Carnegie Mellon University's Tepper School of Business. She co-directs the Collaboration and Conflict Research Lab and teaches graduate courses and executive education seminars on negotiation and organizational behavior. Using theory and methods from organizational behavior, psychology, business ethics, her work focuses on understanding causes and consequences of unethical behavior and identifying strategies for how to promote honesty and ethics in the workplace. So she is the past president of the International Association for Conflict Management and has been featured in many prominent media outlets, New York Times, NPR, Wall Street Journal, Hidden Brain, many other places. She was recognized in 2020 as one of the best 40 under 40 MBA professors by Poets and Quants. And one interesting fact is she received her BA here from Penn State in the psychology program. And so she's the first of 2 alumni here today. I also happen to overlap with her in grad school at UNC Chapel Hill, so I've known Taya for some time. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Taya Cohen.
Okay, hello. It's such a pleasure to be here, to be back. I was an undergrad psychology major here from 1999 to 2003. Terry Vesho picked me out of her intergroup relations course. I was a sophomore, and she said, you should come work in my lab. So I did. And then she said, you should go to grad school in social psych. And so I did. And she said, oh, UNC would be great. Chedden goes great. Why don't you go apply to work? And I said, sure. And I did, though I did disappoint her by not going to Kansas to follow in her footsteps. So in any case, and then at UNC is where I met Daryl. He was a few years behind me, and I'm just thrilled to see you here, just a few hours away, and really honored and a little surreal to be back to give a keynote, right, from where I was back in 1999. So in 2011, Terry actually invited me back shortly after I started at Carnegie Mellon to give a talk in the social psychology group there. And what I talked about there is actually the foundation of what I will talk about today. I've actually done a lot of things in the intervening years, but I keep coming back to this topic of guilt proneness, which is something I started when I was in graduate school, did a lot of scale development work. That's what I presented here in 2011, for those of you who have been around for a while. And I'm building on today with my PhD student, Sofia Rodriguez Chavez, who is here with me. She's a second-year student at Carnegie Mellon and is working with me on this new AI angle, which is the hot topic right now. But before I get into AI, let me begin with the background, sort of the theory behind this. But it looks like the clicker's done, so we'll switch to the pen, maybe. There we go. All right. So this talk centers on moral character, which is a topic I've thought about for a long time. And about 10 years ago, I introduced a theoretical framework to sort of organize what we know about moral character, how I think of it. I think of it as having three components, right? So there's the motivation to do good and avoid doing bad, right? Grounded in this consideration of others. Do you care about harming people or not? But it's not just about having good intentions, right? You have to be able to act on them. So there's the capability to do good, avoid doing bad. You can think of things like self-regulation, conscientiousness, self-control, being able to have difficult conversations where it's hard to be honest, right? So the skills and abilities. And then there's the identity side. Do you actually care? Is it an important part of who you are, how you see yourself, how you want other people to see you? And so moral character I think of as this higher order construct or umbrella construct that I would define as a person's disposition to think, feel, and behave in an ethical way. And of course we know that situations, organizational culture exert a powerful influence on ethical behavior, right? Most of the field of social psychology focuses on that. But at the same time, some people act more consistently, ethically, across situations, across time, even in the face of pressure to do otherwise. And that's how I think of moral character, right? And so if we were to describe someone high in moral character, oh, there we go. We would think of them as trustworthy, as honest, as empathic, right? A lot of Daryl's work is focused on empathy. They care about doing the right thing, more trustworthy, honest, consider the consequences of their choices. And most importantly for my talk today, they have a strong conscience. They feel bad when they do something wrong, this strong sense of interpersonal responsibility. When they do something wrong, they feel bad about their behavior, want to correct for what they did. And that is a trait that I call guilt proneness. It's not about feeling guilty all the time about anything you've ever done. It's instead, if you were to do something wrong, would you anticipate feeling bad about it? But when you've done something wrong. And we know from a lot of research, my own and others, that hiring, promoting people with high moral character, high guilt proneness in particular, it's important for creating an ethical workplace with high-performing employees. It's important for effective leadership. And I'll summarize a bit of this work today. So guilt proneness is a moral character trait. It captures the extent to which a person would feel bad about their behavior if they did something wrong. So I did a bad thing, right? As opposed to I'm a bad person, which would be shame, which is a related but different emotion and a character trait. Even if no one knew, right? It's this private sense of right and wrong. Even if no one knew about what you did, would you feel bad about wrongdoing? And at the core, what I think is why guilt proneness is such a powerful moral character trait and that it predicts behaviors over time is this sense of interpersonal responsibility, right? Not wanting to let people down, wanting to do the right thing, the strong internal obligation to act responsibly. And so what's interesting, one thing I've learned over the years in doing different experiments and different surveys is it's not necessarily that people are thinking about their emotions. It's not actually that. It's just they have this strong sense of interpersonal responsibility. And I'm happy to talk more about that, of sort of how we kind of have triangulated there. But because of this strong sense of interpersonal responsibility that's associated with guilt proneness, there's all these downstream positive consequences. And being in a business school, I focus a lot on the workplace. I came out of psychology, my PhD in psychology, but I've spent the last 15 years or more now in a business school. So I think a lot about work, which is where we spend most of our time. And if I and so a lot of my early work in this area was spent on measurement. And so when I mentioned I was here in 2011, I was in the process of writing this paper, which ultimately was published in JPSB, where we came up with the guilt and shame proneness scale. And we were trying to figure out what was the difference between guilt and shame. And later that evolved into this short 5-item measure, because I focused on guilt proneness specifically. And so I call it the GP5, where you ask people to just imagine a few situations that could happen in their lives, and they respond with how likely it is that they would react in the way described, which is, would you feel bad about your behavior when you've done something wrong? You receive too much change in the store, the sales clerk doesn't notice. What's the likelihood you would feel uncomfortable about keeping the money? You spill red wine on your coworker's cream-colored carpet, you cover it up with a chair at their holiday party. What's the likelihood you feel that the way you acted was pathetic?
Well, you wasted good wine.
You wasted good wine. I know, that's the real problem here. And what's so interesting about sort of these items, sort of these silly items, these 5 items, but why I've kept studying this, keep coming back to this construct for so many years, is that the scores on these items predict these consequential behaviors. Months later, observable behaviors, like you're going to lie to your classmates in a negotiation class, or you go, people, money and economic decision-making games, and I'll tell you a few of the studies I find more interesting and impactful here, including this one. So the most ambitious project I ran about moral character and some of the results I find most compelling came from this diary study I ran in 2011-2012. I called it the Work Experience and Character Trait Project. Came out of the Character Project at Wake Forest University with some philosophers and psychologists there, so very much in line with sort of what the work Daryl is doing of bringing philosophers and psychologists together. And the question we had at the time was sort of, what is moral character? There's all these traits people are studying, and also I wanted to do something big, and so I got some money to do something big. So we ran a 3-month study where we recruited online through a Qualtrics panel, employed adults across the US, all different industries, and we had them do a big battery, an hour-long set of questionnaires at the beginning, and then each week, for 12 weeks, we surveyed them weekly about their behaviors, about their aspects of their organizations, their emotions, their behaviors. And one of the sort of sets of work behaviors we looked at is counterproductive work behaviors, or workplace deviance. And so these are behaviors that harm people, organizations within them, wasting materials and supplies, stealing things, falsifying timesheets, being rude or nasty to coworkers or clients. And we asked people each week, how often did you do this set of 32 behaviors? And some people did a lot, some people didn't do very many. And what we saw was that guilt proneness is associated. So guilt proneness, both assessed it in, at the baseline survey through self-reports, were associated with self-reports each week with counterproductive work behaviors. And as you see, I have graphed here just the people in the top 25th percentile versus lower 25th percentile, just to give you a sense of the effect size. Whereas people who are high in guilt proneness, they said, they might have done 1 or 2 of these. People who are in the bottom quartile were reporting a lot more of these behaviors. And then looking at sort of cross-source validation, a part of this project, we had participants recruit a coworker to answer questions about them. And they answered questions about the counterproductive work behaviors and other behaviors they observed. And again, we see the same pattern, right? And so employees who are self-reporting lower scores on guilt proneness are observed by their coworkers of doing a lot more of these behaviors. And what's interesting is these kinds of behaviors are generally, they're not always very observable, because if you're stealing things and falsifying your timesheets, right, you're not broadcasting it. But here's just how much in the past month, and sort of what people are reporting in 1 week is what their coworkers might see in a month. But we see the same pattern, and we can also look at the coworker reports of guilt proneness and in all the different ways. There's pretty strong self-other agreement, and also test-retest between the first initial study, and we surveyed everything again 13 weeks later, and it looks similar to other common personality traits. And so if you look at just the simple correlations, again, it tends to be around 0.19, 0.2, things like that. But if you think of just asking 5 simple items that you're able to capture this much variance in people's behaviors, I find it very interesting. And so here's the negative behaviors. We also found some relationships with positive helping behaviors, like organizational citizenship. And so this study, then some of the results were published in a few papers around that time in JPSP and Journal of Research and Personality. And then after that, and the work started to get a little bit of media attention. And I was contacted by this public safety psychologist in Colorado, whose name is Ken Jordan, after my work started to be featured in the news. And he said, you know, he calls me, I think it was a cold call on my office phone, and he said, you know, hi, Dr. Cohen, I think your work's really interesting. I work for the state of Colorado, and in the state of Colorado, job applicants for law enforcement positions, police officers, are required to undergo significant psychological testing, right? Background checks, polygraph, clinical interviews, a whole 5-hour, and so he was a psychologist who did these tests. And he said, I think this idea of guilt proneness is really interesting. I'd love to, you know, collaborate, see how it relates to what I look at. And so he included the measure, the 5-item guilt proneness scale, in his battery with all these other measures. And you know, the outcome of this evaluation is whether the person is deemed suitable for hire. And we see there, even in this high-stakes setting, where you know, these are, and it's filtered, all the people that are maybe really low, they wouldn't have even made it to that stage of the hiring process to begin with, right? They, even in this setting, we see this positive correlation between guilt proneness and employment suitability, as well as other, you know, in that paper, in personality individual differences reported other things as well, like driving record and, you know, other kind of responsible versus irresponsible behaviors. And so those are examples of two of the studies that I found interesting and compelling, among other kinds of data sets, but this one because it's in a high-stakes setting. And then that is complemented both my own work and then work by others. Rebecca Schomburg at Wharton, Frank Flynn at Stanford have a lot of interesting papers where they have, where like me, we're sort of finding that June Tangy has been one of the prominent researchers in this area, if you're familiar with her work with, as well. But overall, we see this pattern that individuals who are higher in guilt proneness are more trustworthy, they're more honest in negotiations. That's one of the main areas where I teach in executive education programs and MBA students. And we run these role play study, you know, in the class and seeing who's going to lie to their counterparts. They make more favorable impressions on those with whom they negotiate. They have fewer workplace deviance, illegal behaviors, as I showed you. They work harder. One of the recent papers from Schomburg and Flynn was they looked at absenteeism. And what they found that when people are dissatisfied with their jobs, low job satisfaction, people who are low in guilt proneness, they don't show up, right? They're absent from work. The people in high in guilt proneness, they still show up. And so they see this interaction between job satisfaction and guilt proneness predicting absenteeism. So I thought that was a cool finding. And again, at the core, there is a strong sense of interpersonal responsibility. So that's the background. And then now, with that as background, I want to focus briefly on findings from two recent papers that set the stage for the AI work. And I'll dive a little more into detail on that work. So with guilt, again, to get into, this will come through in some of the findings later, the focus is on behavior. So I did a bad thing. I would call that a negative behavior evaluation, and it's more about private transgressions. And then shame, it's about yourself. I'm a bad person. And that distinction was made earlier by June Tangy and others, but the private versus public was a distinction that I, in my skill development work, really pushed, because I thought it was an important distinction. That you can feel guilty in public or shame in private, but when we are evaluated in public, we tend to see ourselves as other people see us, which is more shame, like you see your whole self. And then the shame proneness items, you know, if you wanted to contrast, would be you give a bad presentation at work, afterwards your boss tells you, your coworkers, it was your fault, that your company lost the contract, what's the likelihood you would feel incompetent, right, as opposed to bad about your behavior. And this is, you know, idea will become interesting when I show you some of the results for people's views about AI and what their considerations are. Are they concerned about how other people would view them versus how they think about themselves? So the two papers that I'll present briefly with Eric Helzer was at the Naval Postgraduate School, now is returning Johns Hopkins, another of my former doctoral students, Young Jung Kim, who's currently at Duquesne in Pittsburgh. And I think she's tuning here, tuning in live today, so hi Young Jung if you're tuning in. we had a paper we published last year called The Character Lens. And the question we were trying to answer in this program of research is, why is moral character associated with moral behavior? And I highlighted that interpersonal responsibility piece, but we wanted to kind of think more broadly than that, and how are people seeing the world? And the basic idea was that people who are relatively higher moral character are seeing the world differently, making sense of the world in a different way than people who are lower in moral character. And so the idea is that sense-making is an inherent part of a person's character. The character traits, such as guilt-proneness, provide a lens through which people filter the world around them, right? Focusing their attention and consideration on certain details, certain aspects of the situation, and shaping the answers to the questions, what is this situation? What is important here? And so the character lens hypothesis that we developed is that high moral character individuals are more chronically aware of the ethical issues and implications of the choices they face, right, resulting in more ethical decisions. And so greater moral awareness associated with higher moral character, or less ethical fading, depending on which terminology you like. And so we have this lens idea, and how in putting together this presentation, I was trying to think of how I would visualize this, with the idea that we have an ambiguous situation. We can think of this, now, well, as we'll do in a moment, and like with AI, with this new technology, how do we think about it? And then we go through the sense-making process. What is this situation? What is this decision? What's important here? And then once we make sense of that, right, then it leads to a decision. Given the situation, what should I do? And I think guilt-proneness actually comes in both of those steps. It's coming into the sense-making of what considerations, what do people notice, what do they prioritize, and then it's coming in on the behavior. Okay, given the situation, I feel this sense of responsibility, to act more trustworthy, responsibly. And I think guilt-proneness as a character trait has inputs into both of these. And so that's sort of conceptually how I think about this. And for those of you who are familiar with personality psychology, and specifically Will Fleeson and Aranda Jaya-Wickrama's work, they develop what's called whole trait theory. And that theory holds that traits describe behavioral patterns. So the moral character associated with moral behavior, right? That would be a behavioral pattern. But traits also describe the social cognitive mechanisms linking the trait to behaviors, the sense-making process. And so the idea in our work is applying the whole trait theory to moral character specifically. And for this talk today, I'll focus on guilt-proneness because that ends up being one of the strongest moral character traits of the various ones we've studied. And so moral awareness is the social cognitive mechanism linking character traits to ethical behavior. And by moral awareness, I'm drawing on a term used by Jennifer Jordan and others as an ability to recognize moral issues in a morally ambiguous situation and ascribe importance to them. So it's both recognizing them, but also thinking this is important for my decision. And in traditional models of ethical decision-making, this is the first step, to just notice. Like, is there, what's the relevant consideration here? You can have good or bad or ethical or unethical outcomes even if you don't realize it, right? Unintended ethicality or unethicality, but in sort of most in deliberate kind of ethical decision-making models, the first idea is you see it. And so that's what we're focusing on here. Do people with higher moral character see the issues differently? And so briefly in this prior work, we have found that guilt-proneness, as well as some other character traits like honesty, humility, or moral identity, centralization, they're associated with greater moral awareness among MBA students, online participants, when analyzing difficult business cases where there could be ethical considerations, legal considerations, financial, strategic considerations. And so some of the examples we've looked at have been, one was a case with an organization struggling with decisions related to providing health care to retirees, where there may be ethical issues as part of this decision, also financial, strategic, business kinds of considerations, legal considerations as well. Another case was about investigating possible lead poisoning. Is it really lead poisoning? Are we responsible? How should we think about this? So it's really interesting listening to MBA students reason through these kinds of cases. And then one of my favorites was Eric Helzer, my co-author, wrote a wonderful immersive simulation, this 4-stage simulation that we were trying to study ethical fading, and it's about an accounting scandal at a big tech firm, and we ask people to imagine they're sort of working at this firm and they notice something, they go to their manager, oh, it's no big deal, this is just how things are done, and then they go through this stage, each stage as they're getting more entangled and enmeshed in this scandal at their firm, and the questions we're asking is about, what are the issues you'd consider, sort of how are people making sense of this, do you report it, whistleblowing? And the overall, finding consistent with the character lens is that individuals with higher guilt proneness identify and they prioritize ethical considerations when faced with these difficult decisions. So greater moral awareness. And these studies generally are pretty separated in time, so we can measure guilt proneness months earlier, have them do analyze these business cases, say 2 months later, I think it was, and we're still seeing these associations, right? So something enduring about their character, filtering how they're making sense of situations. And then one other study in this packet that I liked is giving people the same situation. So for those of you familiar with judgment decision-making research, behavioral economics, you might be aware of the trust game, where it's an economic decision-making task. We used this with our MBA students, told them they would get $10. They can choose to keep it, or if they send it to a classmate, it triples to $30, in which case their classmate could keep all $30 or decide to send half back. So the decision to send the money is an indicator of trust. If the person is on the receiving end, they return the money, that'd be trustworthiness. And what we see is guilt proneness is associated not only with trust and trustworthiness, but also how they think about this task, this decision-making task, the strategies they write about. Is this a game or a task related to ethics and social relationships, or is this purely a financial business decision-making task? Like, how do they even think about it? Would you call it the Wall Street game or the community game if you had to give a label for this? Those are the kinds of questions that we've tried to get at in terms of how is a person thinking about this situation. And so with this sort of as background, Sophia then starts at Carnegie Mellon last year with me. And of course at Carnegie Mellon, probably like here, and I know like here because Daryl said there was a conference on AI. AI is everywhere. We have a new strategic plan. One of the pillars is AI for business. It's Carnegie Mellon where AI was invented, or so I hear, in terms of the origin story. But basically a lot of the technology has come out of there. And so it's, with our computer science department, and I'm sure here too, there's just a lot across the university, and it's something that we've been thinking about. And so it brings with it this interesting context to study how are people thinking about new technologies, and specifically a new technology that is changing rapidly, not regulated very well yet, right, because it's going so fast. And so that's where maybe the character lens or these ideas could be interesting to think about. So technological advances, it introduces new opportunities for people and organizations, right? Productivity, efficiency gains, new markets, new entrepreneurship opportunities, innovation, how artificial intelligence is changing the world, and it is, right? Start, grow your business, transforming, open up any news platform, and there's articles like these. And then there's also the other kind of articles about the serious ethical and legal concerns that some people are thinking about, right? Algorithmic bias, transparency, privacy, plagiarism, academic integrity, right? That's big in college campuses. Copyrights, accessibility, who can use these tools, who's incorporating the data, do we even know that we're being tracked? Should we be worried about the power these tech companies have? OpenAI, Sam Altman, there's at least some people that think we should be very worried about this. The employees secretly using AI for work, right? And not to mention the environmental impacts. And I was just in a conference in Berlin on AI a few weeks ago, and I think the statistic was if you use like an AI generator for an image, or like a few images, it's basically the same as running an incandescent light bulb all day or charging your cell phone overnight. Run 20 ChatGPT prompts, that's the same as charging your cell phone, right? And so we're trying to kind of make sense of how much energy, and it's huge. And some people are very focused on these issues, and some people not at all, right? And so how are we thinking about, should I just put this in a Google search, or should I put this in ChatGPT? And then what are they doing with the data? Did I just kill the environment with that? I don't know. How do we think about it? Or is it better because innovation is wonderful and great, and right? And so we see a lot of debates and tensions. So let's see. We're stuck on. There we go. In terms of where we're at, why I think a person-centered approach is interesting for this context in particular is because it's so new, because of the scale and the pace of innovation, there are guidelines, there are regulations, but enforcement right now and ability to implement this is rather limited and slow. The EU AI Act was a big deal, a big regulation introduced this summer, but they're just figuring out how to roll it out, right? We haven't seen any real enforcement at scale yet. And the guidelines in the United States, there's the National Institute of Standards and Technology, as the Department of Commerce, has guidelines that are voluntary. And then on top of this, the technology, it's mysterious, non-human, and complex. And there's an interesting, this paper by Ellsbach and Stigliano, they pointed out how when features have this, like technology has these features, it can lead to non-conscious biases, things along these lines that shape how we think about these technologies. Right? And so AI is mysterious, non-human, and complex, and the idea then, of course, is that this could contribute to ethical fading or a lack of moral awareness, deprioritizing ethics and safety in favor of rapid innovation. It's too complicated. Somebody already figured it out. Those smart computer scientists, they figured this out. Let's hope. Okay, you talk to them, and they're like, we didn't figure this out. So the question, and here it's really just a basic, this is a first step. The first question is, what influences a person's decision of whether and how to use new technologies, and in this case, AI-powered tools? And the hypothesis flowing from this earlier work that I presented is that employees with higher guilt proneness have greater moral awareness when deciding whether to use AI-powered tools. And so to test this, we ran a survey this summer. We collected data from 200 participants that we recruited online from the platform Prolific. The requirement was that they had to be working either part-time or full-time. And 78% of them were employed by a for-profit firm. 2/3 had a college degree, the rest with less. About half men, right? Average age 38, sort of mixed demographically. And we captured some quantitative information and qualitative information, trying to understand the ethical, legal, and business considerations potential AI users might have. And then the individual characteristics like guilt proneness that might be associated with these considerations. So the survey began. We asked them a little bit about their background with AI. Have you ever used these tools ever in your personal life, or have you ever used them in your work? Which tools have you used in the past month? How often did you use them? How would you describe your understanding? Sort of the subjective sense of understanding. We end up creating a composite of those of sort of experience or expertise with AI. We asked them about, does your organization have policies or guidelines on this? If so, what are they? Most of the sample, 63%, report no AI guidelines or policies, at least this summer, which again goes to the idea that there's not a lot. So it's to the individuals. How are people going to make sense of this? How do they think about these tools? And then what we were hoping for, we didn't find enough variants to really look at, but have you ever used tools in ways that didn't cohere with these guidelines, or have you ever seen anyone else do that? We only had a few responses on that. Okay, the heart of the study, what was really interesting was this vignette. And we asked participants, okay, now imagine you're working in an organization that doesn't have a policy, and you have to write this report. In the past, it's taken a long time. It's been very tedious. You spent hours manually compiling information, trying to make it look professional. And now this new tool becomes introduced that can help you aggregate the information, edit the text quickly and accurately, take you a fraction of the time. What do you think about this? You're now deciding whether to use this AI-powered tool to write the report. What thoughts or considerations would go through your mind when making this decision? And people could type whatever they wanted in terms of how would they think about this. And I'll show you a lot of the text responses, the qualitative data. And then after they typed sort of open-ended responses, we gave them some questions, some rating scales. 2 of those questions tap into moral awareness using 2 items from a scale from Scott Reynolds' work on the topic. There are very important ethical considerations associated with this decision, or the matter clearly does not involve ethics or moral issues, which was reversed. And then there's a few others, very important legal considerations or business considerations, and these are questions I've used in prior work. And after those questions, then, okay, after you've reported your considerations, will you use it? From definitely not to definitely yes. Why? Another open-ended question. Or why not? If you said probably yes or definitely yes, will you share with your coworkers that you used an AI-powered tool? From definitely not to definitely yes. And then finally, the Hexaco 60-item personality inventory, which captures the 6 major dimensions of personality. So the big 5, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and then it also has an honesty-humility factor, which is very related to guilt proneness, but it's much broader, sort of this general benevolence factor of personality. Moral character is broadly construed. And then we had the 5-item guilt proneness scale. We included those at the end because we didn't want to bias anything in the beginning, but given my prior work with test, retest, and other things, it doesn't generally matter at all if you ask these things before or later. It's a pretty stable trait, although over many years' time, it does increase with age. But here we have it at the end, and we're looking again at the associations between guilt proneness and how are people thinking of the use of this tool. So now we get to the qualitative data part, which is not something I have done extensively. I've done a bit of content coding in the past, but this is something Sophia, as a first-year doctoral student, spent her summer and her first-year summer paper immersed in these data, and she probably could tell you every one of these 200 responses by heart, I think. And so what this process looked like was first going, so we used the in vivo software, started with these 3 general themes related to the questions of moral, legal, and business considerations. That was sort of what we were kind of thinking of, but then reading through the responses, there was emergent considerations, emergent themes. We came up, the 2 of us, with 31 first-order codes that we then could aggregate into 15 second-order codes that are guided by our theory. And those are these 15 codes, 15 variables is what the basis of the analysis that I'll present. And you can roughly put these 15 second-order codes into 5 general topics that you can think of as third-order codes: ethical and reputational considerations, privacy considerations, rules, policy, legal-oriented considerations, business-related considerations, broadly construed, like quality, accuracy, and efficiency of the output, and then self and identity considerations related to what I feel like this is authentic, my sense of self-confidence to do this. So, of course, the key hypothesis is related to the ethical considerations. And so about 12.5% of the sample, so out of 200 people, that's about 25 people, mentioned something that we thought is indicative of an ethical consideration. If you think of ethics, personal values, feeling guilty if AI was used, harms to society, plagiarism. So this person, I would think it would be unethical to allow the AI-powered tool to create my report for me. It would be dishonest of me to submit and present this content as my own. Essentially, it would contradict my personal values of integrity and honesty, so I wouldn't do it. So this person has a clear moral, ethical stance. Other people had statements related to external perceptions or reputation. So I'd be scared if someone found out. I would face consequences. So we had 30 people in the sample, 15% as part of their responses mentioned something related to that. And people could mention many different considerations, right? And so we coded each unit here. So I wanted to kind of show you the full set, because I think it's interesting, part by part. So of this ethical consideration, I'll put all 3. This second order code of ethical considerations. There we go. There are sort of 3 parts. One, sort of this category of just general ethical concerns, when people are saying things like, am I doing the good thing or not? I would feel guilty. essentially would contradict my personal values. Is this ethical, right? It wasn't, because we weren't asking them at that stage, would they do it? We were just saying, what do you think about it? It would feel dishonest. Other people with plagiarism, right? And we hear, of course, a lot about this in academia with student work. Then there's the issue of taking credit for work that's not yours. I would think as long as the information wasn't plagiarized, so it's, they're thinking about it, it could go the other way. And then this harms to society one, I've been automated off a job twice. I wouldn't want to help this technology go further. Right? AI is making humanity unnecessarily lazy and has no place in society. Right? So these tools are dangerous and toxic. So people have opinions on this, right? And then this other category, which is interesting because, a lot of times if you teach business ethics related or negotiation ethics, a lot of these topics, sometimes it's like, oh, well, imagine, like, how would you feel if your behavior ended up on the front page of the newspaper, right? The New York Times test or the newspaper test. Like, what would you think if you end up on the New York Times and your mother called you and like, why did you do this? Right? I gotta crank the guilt there. But this really about the shame. Like, what if other people saw this? And this is often thought about as a way to motivate moral behavior. Do you think about how other people would view you? But I would argue it's a bit different than this internal sense of, am I doing the right thing? So we coded these external perceptions. Will I be caught and shamed for using it? Will I be sacked when I'm caught? Will I get in trouble? Will people know? Will others know it is not authentic? So as you see, we had quite a bit of responses in that category. And so in terms of the relationships and regression models, first, if we look at just those moral awareness, the rating scales, those two items, we see guilt proneness is associated with greater moral awareness with the rating scales, so saying there is important ethical moral issues here. The more people use AI or experience those items I showed you, that's associated with less reported moral awareness, at least with the rating scales. Conscientiousness is pretty interesting in that it shows up as negative with the rating scales, but then when we look at the text data, the actual considerations, we see guilt proneness again. The people who are higher in guilt proneness are spontaneously mentioning more of these ethical considerations, right? And if you want, but conscientiousness actually goes in opposite direction, so not quite sure what to make of that, and inclined not to make too much. So in terms of effect size, a 1 unit increase of guilt proneness was associated with a 140% increase in the likelihood of mentioning an ethical consideration. And then we see a negative effect for reputation. The people who are higher in guilt proneness, they're less likely to be thinking about, well, how do other people think about this? Will I get in trouble? That's not as associated. So a 1 point increase in guilt proneness with half as likely to mention one of those external perceptions, considerations. We didn't collect shame proneness in this study. I suspect that if we had, it probably would have been positive there based on some of the other work we've done. And so this is evidence that, of course, is consistent with our hypothesis and with the character lens more generally, that people who are higher in guilt proneness, they are thinking about this new technology through a more ethical lens. And I can go through, I'll go through somewhat quickly the other considerations, but the quick preview is that guilt proneness wasn't associated with any of the other responses in terms of what people wrote in the text, in terms of privacy considerations or rules, policy. But I think some of the responses are interesting, so I'll go through them briefly and happy to talk more. Right, so some people wrote about privacy of the company or client information. Another major concern with AI is whether or not it's violating the privacy of internal information. It's the biggest thing giving me pause when using chatbots for work. I would wonder if my organization has a corporate policy or not. In the vignette, we specifically said your organization doesn't, but people are still saying, well, when I think about this, I kind of wonder what the rules are. And then other people, it's funny, hey, no policy against it, so guess it's good to use, right? They're thinking about it in terms of rules, and some people are thinking, if there's no rules, I won't use it. Other people are saying, no rules, I'm definitely using this, right? It's not prohibited. And again, one thing, this is an initial study, and with any one of these concerns, right, not a huge number of people are saying it, so with the fact that we're seeing non-significant results for most of these, it's not totally clear if, if larger samples, these would show up as stronger, but at least with guilt proneness, we see a significant relationship with the rating scales. So people who are higher in guilt proneness not only are saying there's important moral issues, ethical issues, they're also saying there's important legal issues. And people who use AI a lot, they're saying, no, there's not really important issues here, right? Same. But we don't see any relationship with the open-ended coding. And I have it in bold if you're curious about some of these other findings that pop up. But again, they weren't necessarily predicted, and nothing's really consistent. So I'm inclined to wait till we have larger samples and see if there's things consistent. So that's what you might think of as legal awareness. The business considerations are things that we kind of thought broadly are captured business, things about the quality, accuracy, and efficiency. If the AI tool is easy to use, efficient, accurate, then that's a consideration I would have. Or some people thinking, I'm keenly aware that not all information that's provided by AI is foolproof, so I'm taking a big risk, so that would be a consideration. So people talking about quality and accuracy and efficiency in different ways, sometimes just questioning it as a consideration. Quite a bit, well, not quite a bit, sorry, only about 6 people, but 3% about talking about the task. Well, would I use it for such an important task? Or I would use it depending on the task, or some people think about, and you could go either way, really. Like, it's not important, so it's okay to use, or it is important, so I'd want to use it. But some people talk about the importance or nature of the task. I would use it for this, not this. And then some people talk more about the client or the organization. What does the client think? Does the client trust the materials? I'd wondered how it aligns with the company values. What does the company think? And we have some people mentioning that. And so for the scale, there's important business considerations here. Again, we see guilt proneness positively associated with that, like it was with moral and legal. So people who are higher in guilt proneness are kind of seeing, there's moral issues when I consider whether to use this. There's also legal and business considerations. Again, AI experienced users, they're like, not really any important issues here. It's a negative. And then across these other considerations, non-significant, with the exception of a marginal effect for the client, a negative for guilt proneness in the client and organizational concerns. Again, it was sort of unexpected, but these were the comments. Does the client trust it? Would it improve the chance of making a high-profile client happy? Will this cause my organization to lose money or be harmed? Is it consistent with the organization's goals? How does it align? And so here, I think with guilt proneness, as I said, it's this private internal sense of right and wrong and a conscience. And I think what that marginal effect may be suggesting is similar to the prior findings. It's higher guilt proneness associated with really your own values and your own sense of right and wrong, less about would it please the client or what the organization thinks. And so these might be in some ways similar to those reputational concerns. Okay, let me, last set of considerations are these self and identity ones, which are interesting. People wrote about wanting to feel this sense of pride and authenticity with their work. I'd want to, I wouldn't want to over-rely on this technology. Or I have confidence in my own work. I don't need these tools. I can do this myself. Or I understand these tools. I have no qualms about using it. I use these tools, right? Or we only had there were 2 people with this general aversion to AI aversion, like, I don't use AI, I wouldn't use AI. And so some people are just sort of more full stop opposed. And here we don't see anything with guilt proneness or really any of the others. And again, a few correlations pop up. And so if you're interested in those, we can try and mull them over. Okay. So after all this, after these considerations, are you going to use the tool? Some people will. 123 out of the 200 people will probably use it or definitely use it. Oh, there we go. Sorry. And will you share it? So of that 123, about half or a little more than half are not going to share it with people that they're using it. So I think that's an interesting finding. So people say, I'll probably use it, but probably won't share it. And if I look at the correlations, I thought those sharing ones are interesting. It's not very strong for guilt proneness. We have a marginal positive effect. It's actually a bit stronger for this other character trait, honesty, humility, where people who are higher in honesty, humility, and a little bit maybe guilt proneness, are saying that if they were to use it, they would be more likely to share it. That's consistent. But what I also like about these findings, what's circled in yellow there, is that there's not a direct relationship with whether they're going to use the AI tool or not in guilt proneness. So it's not that people who are high in guilt proneness are just anti the technology, because they're saying there's other considerations, but they are more likely to be saying, like, okay, this is an important consideration. And if you have more ethical considerations and higher moral awareness, it is associated with less use. But also if you have more, if you think there's important business or legal awareness, that is also associated maybe with less use, because you're thinking a little more carefully instead of just saying, yeah, I'm going to use this. And so people who use the technologies more are obviously going to use it more in this context as well, which makes sense. But the sharing, I want to do some further studies. We have some data collection now with AI experts that were recruited from an AI conference in Germany and internationally that is in progress. But I'm really curious to see would you share it? Because if we run a regression analysis, guilt proneness, if you can put honesty, humility in, is not significant because that's really capturing the variance. But again, related to moral character more generally. And I'd say in my work, this is always the question I have in terms of people have different preferences too. Do I study moral character sort of broadly and sort of as a composite of honesty, humility, and guilt proneness and moral identity, or focus narrowly on guilt proneness? Because there's a lot of shared variance, what I would call moral character. But then what we found in looking at the data in this study, and why I decided to present it split, is that the variance here is actually, as you can see in that green line, almost all with guilt proneness and these considerations in terms of the ethical considerations and honesty, humility, the other hexago traits also, but honesty, humility was not as strong. And that is a bit what we saw in the prior papers where with moral awareness, that guilt proneness is stronger overall, even though you see the same direction. And again, it goes to the sense that it's this important character trait. And I think one of the reasons is because moral awareness is not just seeing the moral issues, but also ascribing importance to them. And the interpersonal responsibility piece of guilt proneness, what I think is that mechanism of thinking, yeah, I can see this, and I think it's important, to the decision, and it's my responsibility to consider this and act on this. And that's why I think guilt proneness is such a strong predictor of behavior, and why 20 years later I'm still standing here talking about it. So, okay, with that, let me wrap up by saying guilt proneness positively correlates with moral awareness and ethical considerations when deciding to use AI-powered tools for work. The results are consistent with the character lens hypothesis on ethical decision-making. We have data collection from international AI experts in progress. I can tell you a bit about that. And one of the, thinking about future, and this is where I'd love your thoughts of what would be an interesting next steps. I think Sophia and I are both very interested in moral influence, right? So it's one thing to be aware of these issues, but how do, people in organizations, how can they have influence in how companies, leaders, others proceed in sort of developing either internal guidelines or own practices related to how to use these technologies responsibly? How do we influence others? My one prior paper was taking a social networks perspective on that, and looking who's prominent in the network, connected to other people, and showing that has an effect on influence in the moral domain. And I think there's maybe opportunities there, especially with this new technology. So the findings underscore the importance of moral character and guilt proneness in particular in navigating the ethical challenges posed by AI. And so when we think of some of the issues we're facing now, organizations who want to promote responsible innovation, and there are some out there, hopefully many that want to do that, both in the development of AI, the deployment, the use, right? They should select for and develop the guilt proneness of their employees and leaders. With that, I will end thanking some of the sponsors. We have the Center for Intelligent Business at the Tepper School, which is helping fund this work, along with the Tepper Ethics Fund, and my work on character over the years has been funded from the John Templeton Foundation. And I'll put a plug in that we just went through the strategic planning process at the Tepper School. We have this branding of the intelligent future, data-informed, human-driven, and I love that. And sort of part of this work is really putting the human part of that, the human-driven side of technology. And now I think I have 10 minutes for questions. Great, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This was super cool. I took so many notes.
Oh, wow, good, wonderful.
My question I had is, it seems when you we're putting, I think it was a yellow light quotes.
Mhm. Yeah, and the reputational and external ones, yeah.
Yes, they seem to be mostly anticipatory.
Right.
At least in what I could.
Yeah, right.
read.
Would I get caught?
What exactly? And so my question is, part of the ethical fading literature also talks about this idea that we tend to see ourselves more ethical than we really are.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious whether, in a different study, you could also observe whether, people say something but then do something
Yeah.
else.
Yeah, how are you thinking about in sort of well, this one I think they're anticipatory because it's like, what would you be thinking about when deciding, because you haven't decided, and so they're thinking about, well, I think about, would I get caught, and then I think if they, I mean, I imagine, I'm not sure if this is sort of the base of the question, but if people then choose to use it, they would then justify it more, or think there's
Right.
less risk. And I think that's consistent with all the findings we have with people who use the tools more for their work, people who use different tools, so all that experience, people who feel they understand more, at least subjectively, they are saying, like, this is not really a big deal. There's not a lot of issues to consider. They're not really thinking about this. So I think that would maybe be consistent with what you're thinking.
Yep. I think that the crux of what I was trying to think through is, for what reason how are they using it, right? Am I
Yeah.
using it to like fully delegate a task, or am I collaborating with the,
Yep.
or do I see it as a coworker, as a separate entity that I consult with? So I think you'll find variation in how they rationalize these things if they fully delegate versus, oh, this is someone I pick their brain, so to speak.
Yeah,
So-
I love this question. To me, one really interesting question is when. And it was interesting. So this conference that Sophia and I were at in Berlin, what was cool about this conference, they had artists and creatives and people using the tools, as well as developers and AI ethics and safety. And one of the people there who spoke was an Emmy Award-winning TV writer who uses AI, and he was describing his process. And what he was saying is like, oh, well, basically when I have a new script, and I sort of just put in as a first step the blank page and get this idea, and then I said, okay, I don't want to do that, I know that. And when he was speaking, and I talked with him, I actually think there's a real danger in using, and I think the ethical, because like using it as a first step in the process, because then we're anchored on the technology, right, which is very different than maybe editing. And I actually just did this I had to write an abstract for a different project, and so I have the PowerPoint, I had a rough draft abstract, and then I'm like, I'm curious what Gemini and Copilot have to say about this. So I uploaded the PowerPoint. I was like, write an abstract that is clear. Here's the one I have, edit. And then I edited. I was like, well, there's one sentence in here I liked, but the others. But it was interesting, like thinking of the difference in when in this process we use it, and are there different ethical considerations of using it from scratch, to your point, versus, well, now I'm in some kind of hybrid, either a weak or strong AI-human hybrid. And are there different considerations? And so I think the way in which people are thinking about it in there and how we're using it is interesting, because most, what do we want to fully delegate? What's ethical to fully delegate? And I would also say one idea related to one of my colleagues, business ethics professor, is philosopher Derek Lieben. He just wrote this interesting blog post talking about these weak versus strong hybrid models. Like, where do you want the human in the loop? And what's interesting, if we fully delegate, then that's fine, the AI takes it, or we do, it's fully manual, and that's fine. But the real danger is with these weak hybrid, where you have a human who's sort of monitoring, but they become complacent, and then you really don't notice. And that's actually could be worse than fully automating, because it's like this appearance that we actually have someone there to monitor, but because the AI is pretty good, you just don't, and that may be worse than other models, and so just having a person there. Anyway, that's going off on a bit of a tangent, but I think there's these broad questions now, and how are people thinking about the ethics of using it at the different stages of the process, I think is interesting. Yeah, Carolyn. Sorry.
By the way, if anybody online has any questions, please just drop them in the Q&A chat, or the chat feature. No, the Q&A feature, just separate from the chat feature. We'll try to field a couple of those too, if possible.
Thank you so much, Taya. That was so interesting. I have two questions. First, what do you think would happen if and when there's some social consensus around the ethics of AI, if we ever reach that point?
Yeah.
So let's just say as a society, we're like, AI is completely ethical. What would guilt-prone people do? Are they then like, well, it's been established socially, and now I don't need to think about the ethical considerations? That's the first question. And the second question, I'm just so intrigued, because I feel like there's so many things that I'm I don't want to make this question about me, but there's like a lot of new things that I'm like, is it ethical to do this or not? Like remote working, that's like this new thing. So I guess to what extent would your findings generalize to different tools or even situations of ambiguity? And so, you know, like remote work, like is it ethical for me to, you know, work remotely when, you know, I know other people are coming into the office and I just have the ability to work remotely. So in that case, would you see the same thing, or like guilt-prone people are going to notice the ethics of these ambiguous situations and be less likely to maybe utilize some of the tools that other people aren't seeing the ethics of those? So.
Yeah, so one, I think, just because I've seen that guilt proneness predict behaviors in all different domains, I think it's broadly about being attuned to norms. And that would be all different. So work from home, I think you're probably high in guilt proneness if you're even thinking of that as an ethical consideration, right? Other people don't. It's just like a personal decision or a business decision or whatever, right? And guilt prone, so what's interesting, I would say, I have a paper with Emma Levine, Maurice Schweitzer on trustworthiness. And actually, this is where one place we see guilt proneness differing from honesty, humility. And it relates to this being sensitive to norms and it gets to this idea of when guilt proneness will be more activated or have a particularly important effect. And so I mentioned that trust game that I described. Honesty, humility in that is associated with returning more money to another person regardless of how much they send you. And so we have one study. It's like, imagine either the person sent you out of 20, they could send $20 that triples to 60, right? And then the second person can decide whether to send half of the $60 back, or they send $2 that triples to 6, but it could have been up to 60. And so by only sending 2, they're signaling they don't trust you. What we see there, guilt proneness is not associated with returning the money, the trustworthiness, when they signal distrust. When the person could have sent 20 and they sent 2, it's like, no, I don't have to send the money back. And so honesty, humility is, actually, there's a different study, not by me, by some Dutch colleagues, where they show, like, regardless of how much the person sends, that people just send more back, which is this general benevolence. And so that, to me, is actually one of the most interesting nuances or difference between these character traits where, in general, both honesty, humility, guilt proneness are associated with these more positive behaviors, and there's lots. But there is an important difference between just general, just being, sending money, returning money regardless of how the person treats you. Guilt proneness is much more about being sensitive to moral norms. And this idea that if the person didn't activate that sense of responsibility, then I don't feel this internal obligation, right, because they violated that. So going to your comment, I think guilt proneness is going to be sensitive when we feel like this internal obligation. And if there is a world in where there is consensus and the AI is ethical, I don't believe that world exists because I think there's always going to be new questions. But if there was more consensus, then I don't know that, if it's really not if I don't feel this personal responsibility to think about these considerations, then that might not be activated and people aren't just going to go around looking for it. And so in that, but generally it's with the character lens, if I kind of go back to that model, it's like, is there an ambiguous situation, right? And if it's an ambiguous situation, or at least one where people could think about differently, guilt proneness is going to be a little more sensitive to the moral norms. And working from home is another great example where I think if we probably ran a survey in that context, we'd probably see it because it's not clear, because there's certainly potential ethical consideration, there's business, strategic, there's selfish considerations, not my problem, the company will deal with it, versus no, this is letting other people down because I'm not around. And people are high in guilt prone if they feel that more acutely and they see it. So this, it's actually, I see it as a win-win actually, in that it's interesting, and this is where the term and the label is a little unfortunate. And so I call it guilt proneness because June Tangi called it guilt proneness and other people, because it is more about the anticipated emotion, but it's not about feeling guilty all the time. And it's when I do something wrong, what I feel bad about my behavior, and I can change my behavior and I can do something differently in the future. So it's not pleasant to feel guilt, right? But it's also, I've done something wrong, I've made a mistake, I've made a terrible presentation, okay, I can acknowledge that, I can feel bad about it, but it's different than shame, which is more expansive. Then that's associated much more with feeling bad overall. It's a much more painful emotion. And so guilt, the consequences, actually guilt is positively associated with well-being and satisfaction. And It's negatively associated with rumination. It's negatively associated with depression. So shame proneness, which is related, is feeling bad about yourself when you do something wrong, is positive with correlate with depression, be more negative. And guilt proneness is actually the opposite. I've done some of that work in surveys, but there's others who are more in the social developmental psychology, like June Tang does a lot with kids. And so I'd say guilt proneness, because it's focused on the behavior, is actually good for individuals generally as well. It's associated with more forgiveness. I have a prior paper showing that people hiring guilt proneness are more forgiving of others who've harmed them in the past, which is, we had them write letters to someone who'd harmed them. It was an interesting study where we were trying to look at that, which you could arguably say is sort of better for the person in some circumstances. But here, yeah, you're right. I think it's good for the companies because it's associated with better performance, working harder, things along those lines. So it's generally, but there is, okay, one final thought where it can be bad for individuals. I have a prior paper with Scott Wiltermuth in JPSB that's titled, "I'd Only Let You Down," and then it has a title after it. But it's the idea that people who are low in guilt proneness are more than happy to free ride on other contributions. And so what we did in that study, a number of experiments, but like, would you want to link your outcomes with a classmate who's doing much better than you? So you have this, if you had a classmate who's getting a much better grade than you in accounting, and your grade could be averaged with theirs, would you want to do that? People in lower are like, yeah, I get a higher grade, that's great. People in lower in guilt proneness would do that. People who are higher in guilt proneness is like, no, I wouldn't want to harm my classmate. So I would say that's more ethical, more trustworthy, but they're harming themselves in that they're not getting a higher grade by free riding. But in terms of, if your question was more around sort of the mental health or the feeling side, guilt proneness has this ironic effect where it's generally better because it's more about a specific behavior. And shame is, funny enough, is positively associated, but it's that darker side of it.
So I do see your hand, Terry. There's 2 questions online. Let's do like 3 questions.
Okay, and I don't want to cut too much into the rest of this time.
So one of the former consortium RA, Clara Severo, hi Clara, has a great question. She says, amazing talk. Thank you, Taya. Do you think someone's identity fusion or interconnectedness to their company would influence guilt proneness or cause people to disengage from ethical concern?
Yeah.
For example, if they are less fused to their company, do you plan on looking on any of those kinds of individual differences in the future?
I plan to. I did in 2006. That was the very first paper I love. So I love that question. It was a paper we titled Group Morality. It's my very first paper, my first year in graduate school. You may remember it, Daryl, for when I published it in 2006. But yeah, and so this again gets to Caroline's question too, and it has to do with what are the moral norms. And so we had a paper we called Group Morality that was trying to get at this, and the idea that if we had people empathize with their in-group, we had a prisoner's dilemma game, economic game kind of task, and if they empathize with their in-group, and we're really thinking about, then they didn't want to, then the moral norm that's activated there is not wanting to let your group down. So if you think of identity fusion, if I'm fused with my organization, I care a lot about it, I don't care about anyone else outside of that, then it feels like the moral thing to do is to do whatever it takes to advance the company. And I think, there is a case to be made that when people really feel that identity fusion or that strong attachment, empathy, and they don't think about the consequences outside of that, then the guilt proneness could actually lead to those more harmful behaviors. And we show in some ways that it can. In general, I think guilt proneness is associated with more, these considerations, not being so focused on the in-group, but to the extent that you really become fused and you can't see out of that, then it would certainly tip. And what you might get the most moral people behaving the most unethically. And that was the premise of that paper in PSPB in 2006. And I've always thought that was an interesting idea to think of group versus individual morality and what are the moral norms activated. Yeah, thank you.
The other question before I'll hand it to Terry for the last question here. It's from Daniel Sperling. Thank you very much for your presentation. I'm curious what you think of the role that regulation of AI use would have in the relationship between guilt proneness and moral awareness. Do you think that such a relationship would be moderated by it? Do you have any plan testing that in the future?
Yeah, I think, what we hope regulation will do is make everyone sort of use technology more responsibly in a way that society broadly can agree. is more ethical, and then it could moderate, and that guilt proneness may not have as strong of an effect if we all sort of have more consensus around that. They maybe don't. The more ambiguous, the idea of strong versus weak situations. So if it's a strong situation and everyone is sort of clear, and here's the way we use this, and here's the way we don't, then individual characteristics like guilt proneness may not have as much impact. On the other hand, given that what I think will happen with regulation is it's going to be hard to enforce, and maybe it's enforced in sort of even just the way the EIAU Act and others are written now, it's really about risk. So they're going to go after, and regulate sort of certain kinds of usage cases more than others, which case, even if these regulations become implemented, how well they're enforced, I think there's going to still be a lot of discretion. And the more discretion, I think, is where guilt proneness would sort of have an effect, because generally there's going to be some individual choice in this. So I think now it would be interesting in the situation, given that guilt proneness is with a person's values, like if you think the regulation is wrong or bad, as a person going to say, well, which norms am I going to comply with? I think guilt proneness, again, is about adhering to norms. But if there's a tension between the regulation and what I personally think is right versus wrong, it could lead to different behaviors. Right now, I think the space is just really unclear. Right, the regulations are unfolding.
I was just thinking about your conceptualization of moral character and the three components, and you were saying you're not sure always where to focus on the moral character or the guilt proneness. And I guess the one question I had for you is the special role of guilt proneness, could that in part be due to the fact that it's the only one of the three components that taps into self-costs, like cost to the self?
Yeah. Maybe. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. So guilt proneness certainly correlates with lots of others. And if you think of the typical big five kind of, guilt proneness correlates with conscientiousness, which I would put, about 0.3 correlation. So which I kind of put down here. It correlates about 0.6 with honesty, humility. It correlates about 0.6 with like empathic concern and other ones. It correlates pretty highly, maybe 0.4 or whatever, with moral identity. And so it taps, but I don't know, it's interesting. So this model came out of doing this character traits in the workplace study where we had 24 different individual differences that we tried to look at. Like moral foundations was really popular at the time, and I don't know, moral ethical decision making, the DIT, all these different measures. And I do think what's interesting is guilt proneness, even though it's even just these 5 items, it does seem to relate to all these other measures. My hesitancy in making a strong claim on that is all these individual difference measures are highly correlated. So it's not like I don't know that it would be the only one, but if I think of like empathy, empathic concern really being warm, caring, considerate feelings, which associate with moral behavior, that's certainly related to moral character, but it doesn't get that self side, that it's my responsibility. And I do think there's something powerful that like I would feel bad, and it seems to be tapped into, I don't want to let others down. And that's, of course, related to a consideration of future consequences. And so there is something, I think I share your intuition, that it's a little bit different than these just other-oriented characteristics that I think have gotten a bit of study. And then the same thing, the moral identity is like, I want to see myself as the kind of person who is fair and kind and friendly. That's a little more inward-looking, whereas guilt proneness is not like, I can focus on my own behavior, kind of deal with the negative emotions associated with that, like Larissa was highlighting, but also that the reason I would feel this way is because of the impact that it has on others. And there seems to me something special on that is a little more unique. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Well, if you have any other questions, I encourage you to follow up with Taya
Thank
afterwards.
you. It's such an honor, pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.